John Stuart Mill. In many American colleges, the writings of J.S. Mill are studied in courses in government or in philosophy, and it may therefore be asked why they should also have a place in the study of literature. It may seem that Mill is less literary than other Victorian prose writers. His analytic mind is preoccupied with abstractions rather than with the concrete details that are the concern of the more typical writer. His self-effacing manner and his relatively transparent style are the marks of an author whose value lies in generalizations from personal experience rather than in the rendering of particular experiences for their own sake. Yet a knowledge of Mills's writings is essential to our understanding of Victorian literature. He is one of the leading figures in the intellectual history of his century, a thinker whose honest grappling with the political and religious problems of his age was to have a profound influence on writers as diverse as Matthew Arnold, Algernon Charles Swinburne, and Thomas Hardy. Mill was educated at home in London under the direction of his father, James Mill, a leader of the Utilitarians. James Mill believed that ordinary schooling fails to develop our intellectual capacities early enough, and he demonstrated his point by the extraordinary results he achieved in training his son. As a child, John Stuart Mill read Greek and Latin, and as a boy he could carry on intelligent discussions of problems in mathematics, philosophy, and economics. By the time he was 14, as he reports in his autobiography, 1873, his extensive education enabled him to start his career with an advantage of a quarter of a century over his contemporaries. Mill worked in the office of the East India Company for many years and also served a term in Parliament in the 1860s. But his principal energies were devoted to his writings on such subjects as logic and philosophy, political principles, and economics. His System of Logic, 1843, earned him the position of the most respected philosopher in mid-Victorian England. He began as a disciple of the utilitarian theories of his father and of Jeremy Bentham, but became gradually dissatisfied with the narrowness of their conception of human motives. Working with the empiricist tradition, utilitarians attempted to show that most traditional views of politics, ethics, and psychology were based on nothing more than long-standing superstition and habit, and that superstition and habit generally stood in the way of progress. Most famously, they challenged the idea that human beings functioned according to God-given intuitions and drives, arguing that the mind worked on the physical process of the association of feelings. According to the utilitarians, then, individuals were ultimately motivated not by an innate sense of right and wrong, but by the simple desire to find pleasure and avoid pain. Politically, the utilitarians thus lobbied for whatever would bring the greatest pleasure or happiness to the greatest number. Though Mill was raised in this no-nonsense, reforming tradition, his honesty and open-mindedness enabled him to appreciate the values of such anti-utilitarians as Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas Carlyle, and, whenever possible, to incorporate some of these values into the utilitarian system. In part, this sympathy was gained by the lesson he learned through experiencing a nervous breakdown during his early 20s. This painful event, described in a chapter of his autobiography, taught him that the lack of concern for people's affections and emotions, characteristic of the utilitarian system of thought, which had typified his own education, was a fatal flaw in that system. His tribute to the therapeutic value of art, because of its effect on human emotions, both in his autobiography and in his early essay What is Poetry, 1833, would have astonished Mills's master, Bentham, who had equated poetry with pushpin and idle pastime. Mills's emotional life was also broadened by his love for Harriet Taylor, a married woman who shared his intellectual interests and eventually became his wife in 1851 after the death of her husband. Mill later described her as the inspirer and in part the author of all that is best in my writings. They shared a commitment to the cause of female emancipation, one of several unpopular movements to which Mill was dedicated. Throughout human history, as he saw it, the role of a husband has always been legally that of a tyrant, and the object of his far-seeing essay, The Subjection of Women, 1869, was to change law and public opinion so that half the human race might be liberated from slavery and regarded as equals. The subjection of women was, however, only one aspect of the tyranny against which he fought. His fundamental concern was to prevent the subjection of individuals in a democracy. His classic treatise on liberty, 1859, is not a traditional liberal attack against tyrannical kings or dictators. It is an attack against tyrannical majorities. Mill foresaw that in democracies such as the United States, the pressure toward conformity might crush all individualists, intellectual individualists in particular, to the level of what he called a collective mediocrity. Throughout all of his writings, even his discussions of the advantages of socialism, Mill is concerned with demonstrating that the individual is more important than institutions such as church or state. In On Liberty, we find a characteristic example of the process of his reasoning, but here, where the theme of individualism is central, his logic is charged with eloquence. A similar eloquence is evident in a passage from his Principles of Political Economy, 1848, a prophetic comment on the fate of the individual in an overpopulated world. There is room in the world, no doubt, and even in old countries, for a great increase in population, supposing the arts of life go on improving, and capital to increase. But even if innocuous, I confess I see very little reason for desiring it. It is not good for a man to be kept perforce at all times in the presence of his species. A world from which solitude is extirpated is a very poor ideal. Solitude, in the sense of being often alone, is essential to any depth of meditation or of character, and solitude in the presence of natural beauty and grandeur is the cradle of thoughts and aspirations which are not only good for the individual, but which society could ill do without. Nor is there much satisfaction in contemplating the world with nothing left to the spontaneous activity of nature, with every rood of land brought into cultivation, which is capable of growing food for human beings, every flowery waste or natural pasture plowed up, all quadrupeds or birds which are not domesticated for man's use, exterminated as his rivals for food, every hedgerow or superfluous tree rooted out, and scarcely a place left where a wild shrub or flower could grow without being eradicated as a weed in the name of improved agriculture. If the earth must lose that great portion of its pleasantness which it owes to things that the unlimited increase of wealth and population would extirpate from it, for the mere purpose of enabling it to support a larger, but not a better or happier population, I sincerely hope, for the sake of posterity, that they will be content to be stationary, long before necessity compels them to it.